Hello class. This week we're looking at chapter 4. This chapter really focuses on the formulation of our work with clients, our formulation of the case, specifically as it relates to schizophrenia. Now, when I supervise first year students, a lot of the times what comes up is some fear and anxiety related to this word, related to the word formulation. I think people start classes and they hear this word thrown around, but a lot of times professors don't really stop and talk about what exactly is a formulation. Well, another way to think about a formulation is what is your understanding of what is going on with the client? So, in our case for this week, the formulation would be what is your understanding of the client's symptoms, where they come from, and how they affect the client's life. So pretty simple, right? But when we call it formulation and then we throw the word assessment in there too, sometimes it can be overwhelming for students. So before we really get into specifically what a formulation of a client's case with schizophrenia is, we want to kind of dispel some of those fears and anxieties that are related to that. So now with that out of the way, how do we think about for case formulation for a client who has schizophrenia? Well, the formulation and the assessment are really the first steps in our treatment planning. Because let's stop and think about this. If we can't articulate, if we don't know for ourselves, let's kind of for a moment forget everybody else involved in treatment. If we can't articulate for ourselves and for our client where their difficulties are coming from, what they're related to, what exacerbates them, or how they cope with it, how can we really come up with a treatment plan that would work for them? And the answer is we absolutely cannot. So the first steps are in really exploring what's going on for your client when they're experiencing psychotic symptoms. So your textbook gives you quite a bit of information just beyond even just this, and then goes on and talks about treatment and some very specific strategies you can use. But what I want to focus our time, what I want to focus this lecture on, is talking about exactly how we go about the formulation, the initial assessment, gathering of information, and the use of that information to come up with a picture of the client. So I'm going to use our textbook kind of as a cheat sheet for myself because I want to make sure I get all of the terminology exactly the way it is in the textbook to avoid any confusion. So the area I'm looking at is the antecedent and coping interview. And you can think of this as an intake interview, perhaps. So you might be working at an agency and you get a referral, or you get a walk-in client, or somebody that you've been working with discloses that they're experiencing some psychotic symptoms. So the first thing you're going to do, of course, after establishing safety in case they are experiencing psychotic symptoms there in the room with you, is the antecedent and coping interview. This is a semi-structured interview, and what that means is that it does give you a little bit of leeway to ask additional questions. So some approaches have a very structured interview where you're supposed to ask the questions in the same order, in the same way. But this is a semi-structured interview, so there are definite components that you're supposed to hit in the process of doing it, but you have a little leeway, a little freedom of how to do that. So what this will do for you is provide the basis for intervention, as I talked about before. So your textbook calls it a basis of intervention. I call it getting the basic information that you need. Call it what you will. This is giving you the information that is necessary to really build the foundation of your work with the client. So the first thing you want to do is determine the nature and the variation of psychotic symptoms. Well, this seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Before you can begin treatment planning, you really have to understand what the symptoms are. Are they delusions? Are they hallucinations? Are they auditory? Are they visual? Are they tactile? Which, by the way, the tactile hallucinations are very, very rare. We do not see this very frequently in our work, but it does happen. There are also olfactory hallucinations, which are also fairly rare. So you want to understand what exactly the psychotic features or the psychotic symptomology is for your client. As you do that, you want to also understand how frequently they occur and how intense they are. And one way I try to remember this, and I'll talk about this quite a bit throughout this course and in other courses that you might have me for, is the idea of FIDO, F-I-D-O. So a really cute nickname for a dog, but it helps us, it's an acronym that helps us remember things to clarify with our clients. F for frequency, so how frequently do these symptoms occur? I for intensity, how intense are they? You know, from a scale of 0, because with CBT, you know, we love scales. From a scale of 0, doesn't bother me at all. You know, I never think about it, to a scale of 10 being the absolute worst I can imagine. Where are you? How intense is this? You know, how intense is the ringing in your ears, or how intensely do you hear the voice in your head? Then you have D, duration. How long does this last? So if a client tells you that they hear somebody laughing at them, you want to clarify. Is the laughter happening all the time? Is it just kind of a background laughter that they're hearing consistently? Or is it something that occurs in short spurts every couple of days or something like that? And the O is, sorry about that, the O just flew out of my mind. Give me just a second here. So we have frequency, intensity, duration, and onset. I knew I'd get to the O. The onset is you want to know when the symptoms started. We'll address this a little bit more when we talk about antecedents in just a moment, but you also want to know if this is the first time your client is reporting hearing voices, or if this is the first time you've seen a client. Maybe they're a brand new client for you. You want to find out when that symptomology began. So, of course, your textbook will talk quite a bit more about various instruments you can use to help you do that initial assessment of the psychotic symptoms, what their nature is. But this will help you kind of get a nutshell understanding of what we're looking for when we talk about that during the antecedent and coping interview. Then, of course, because this is CBT and we're concerned about not just thoughts or experiences, but also the emotions, you want to talk to your client about the emotions that accompany each psychotic symptom. So that's the next part your textbook talks about. So when your client is experiencing a delusion, or when they are experiencing a hallucination, are they also having some kind of an emotional response? Maybe that emotional response is in response to having the hallucination, for example, or it could be kind of comorbid. So as I talk about this, I'm reminded of a client I worked with. He was a young man experiencing his first psychotic break. He was actually in high school, so it was fairly early onset. And he talked about when he would be out at a particular fast food restaurant he really liked, and he would see a certain type of a woman, specifically for him. And again, we'll talk about the triggers in just a second. For him, it was tall blonde women. He believed that they were aliens, and he could hear them talking about him, even if they were, across the parking lot, turned away, and he didn't see their lips moving. He believed that he could hear that they were talking about him, or that they were thinking about him. So here we have kind of a combination of a delusion and a hallucination, because the belief was that they were aliens, and there's absolutely no proof of that. Chances are they were not aliens. And then the hallucination is hearing their voice. So I went through the FIDO, as I said, with him. And the next step is I wanted to know, what was he feeling when he encountered these women? And what he told me was that he felt a lot of shame. He felt ashamed that he must have been doing something to elicit their laughter or elicit their derision. So for him, there were a lot of themes of shame throughout the work that we did together. But as you know, if I hadn't inquired about the emotion, if I just focused on the hallucination and kind of stayed at the, I like to think of it as the quantitative level with him, I would have never known that there were also these feelings of shame and guilt and low self-esteem that went along with it. And that's an important distinction to make when working with our clients, because we also have to address those feelings as well. They're unlikely to occur completely separately, completely unrelated to the schizophrenia or the hallucinations, because you can also experience hallucinations and psychotic features with other diagnoses as well. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee to wet my whistle, as they say, and then we'll continue. It's a lot of talking, a lot of one-way talking. So you kind of really want to understand what it is that they're feeling, what it is that they're experiencing. You know, is it anxiety or sadness? And you want to do that by providing some language for them, because let's be mindful of the fact that not all of our clients have all of the necessary terminology for expressing their feelings. So what I like to do is I might ask a client, let's use this client as an example. I might say, when you saw this woman and heard her laughing at you, what is it that you felt? And my client would frequently say, I don't know what I felt. And sure, we could jot down client is unaware of feelings and move on, but we may want to probe a little bit. So I might say, was there any feelings of worry? Client's like, no, not worry. Anxiety? Or like you just don't know what might happen? Yeah, I just didn't know what would happen. Oh, so I wonder what that was like for you. You know, when I feel like I don't know what's going to happen, it might be a little scary for me. Oh, it was totally scary for me, my client might say. So I hope you're starting to see that by continuing these conversations, and that's why a semi-structured or an unstructured interview can be so helpful for our work with clients. You're able to unpack some of that language that they may not be able to communicate with you in. They may not know all the words. They may not know the word anxiety or what it exactly relates to. They might not know the word depression or specifically what that relates to. But by giving them some substitute words and just generally explaining the concept, you might get at some of those feelings. Or, of course, let's allow for the fact that a client may be completely unaware and disconnected from their emotions, and they might say, I felt nothing. And in this case, once you've probed, if you're getting nothing, which doesn't happen very often, but it can, if you're getting nothing, you can then move on knowing that you did what you could to get at that information. So the next part is the triggers. So with CBT, we're really interested in the ABCs, right? The antecedent, behavior, and the consequence. So we know we can think of the behavior as the response in terms of, the emotional response, or we can also think about it in terms of the actual behavior to cope, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we also want to talk about what gets the ball rolling, if you will. What starts that cycle for our clients, and that's what the antecedent is. So in talking to my clients, I always try to understand when they're, unless the voice they hear is kind of constant and never goes away, which I haven't had a client who's presented that way, but when they're experiencing those moments of hallucinations, if they're hearing something, or I once had a client who would experience some tactile hallucinations, I like to find out what they were doing, what they had been doing before, what they were feeling prior to that happening. We just talked about what they're feeling during, but it's also important to know what they're feeling prior, because that can be one of the antecedents. And in general, what was going on for them. So in exploring this with your clients, we kind of get at the precipitating factors. So in this case, I'm thinking of a client, the one with the tactile hallucinations, who would begin to have hallucinations and delusions when she was under a lot of stress at work, when maybe she had a deadline coming up, or if she had maybe a fight at home and a lot of things happening at work. As the stress escalated for her, after so long, she could no longer deal with the stress, and she would experience one of these psychotic symptoms. So for her, we would look at, how well she had managed to cope with the stress prior, if she was doing the self-care things that we had talked about, some of that homework I had given her to engage in self-care. When she feels her stress levels going up, we would look at whether or not she had been tracking her stress levels to see, was she aware that, it's getting really up there, I gotta do something. And a lot of times, right before she had even a small psychotic break, because her hallucinations didn't last very long, but they would occur from time to time. And it was almost always, not almost, it was always related to a lot of stress at work when coupled with stress or a negative experience at home. So that's what you want to do for your clients. You want to understand, where are they when they happen? Who are they surrounded by when this happens? And what were they feeling beforehand? Now that can be a little difficult to do with a new client, because you don't have necessarily the rapport established. You don't know a whole lot about their life just yet. But hopefully with time, you're able to find out this information, and you're able to track by asking these questions about the precipitating factors and about the antecedents. You're able to track kind of some of the recurring themes, if you will, that are related to them experiencing hallucinations or delusions. So, once we've talked about triggers, we can then talk about consequences. So that's the A, B, and C of CBT. When we talk about consequences, we want to look at how the client feels, what is it that they do, and what is the result of what they do. So for a lot of our clients, when they've experienced a hallucination or a delusion, they may get scared, or they may get really angry or irritable, and those are the consequences for them. So you might want to talk to them about how that affects their life, how that changes the decisions they make, how that changes the ways in which they interact with other people, the ways in which they're able to attend to their activities of daily living. So the woman I mentioned a moment ago, who had the tactile hallucination, she also had some visual hallucinations as well, and they were quite terrifying for her. So one thing that she mentioned that she would frequently see would be a figure in red standing at the foot of her bed, and it would terrify her, because as a child she was told a lot of stories about demons. So she would see that, become really terrified, be unable to sleep at night, and then miss work the next day, sometimes stay in bed all day, sometimes miss several days of work, and eventually the consequence was, and this kind of gets a little bit into the coping too, which is the next section in your book. So what would happen is, eventually, because she missed so much work, because initially her hallucinations were fairly frequent, so there's that Fido again, she was put on probation at work, and she wasn't allowed to miss more than I forget the specifics now, but more than a day or so every so many weeks without a doctor's note. So it was very challenging for her. And the consequences was that she was withdrawing from all of her social relationships. She was withdrawing from her family. She was afraid to share what was going on with her with the other people in her life because they didn't believe her. And after several people not believing you, she was afraid to tell others that what was going on because she had the fear of more people not believing in her. And because she was already scared, the additional impact of what it might be for her, and she had a fair amount of insight, but the impact of what it might mean for her to be this person that sees things nobody else does, and to have her family members not believe her, it was scary and unsettling for her. So she began to withdraw and stopped talking to people and went, because by nature she was actually really funny and really engaging and so interesting. She had a lot of really interesting hobbies. She had a master's degree in fine art, so she knew so much about the history of art and different painters. So she really had a full understanding of life. But when this started to happen, she started to withdraw. And she wanted those relationships but couldn't tend to them. So it was very difficult for her to kind of balance those two things, both the psychotic symptoms of the schizophrenia, but also her draw for people. So when we talk about coping, then, we want to look at what is it that the client can do, or what is it that the client does, before we get to the can do. Let's talk about what it is that they actually do. So we want to look at what it is that the client does in situations like that. So I mentioned for this woman, she stayed at home and did nothing. She kind of settled into her bed, settled into her routine, and tried to take her mind off of it by mostly sleeping. The young man I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, his way of coping was to play music videos on YouTube. So there were certain songs that he liked, certain musicians that he liked, so he would escape into that world. So different clients have different forms of coping. It could be anything that's helpful to them. And sometimes things that are not helpful to them are also coping strategies. And our job then, especially in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy, is to try and help them evaluate what's helpful, how helpful is it, and what is not helpful. That way you can do more of what's helpful and less of what's not helpful. And you can kind of build on the existing infrastructure of your client's coping skills. So you can kind of think of it in a little bit from a strengths based perspective as well. So if a client is really, really artistic, it might be a really great coping strategy for them to kind of lean into that. So if what they like to do after they've experienced a hallucination is draw, encouraging them to draw and helping them evaluate how helpful is the drawing might be a really good way to go. So if a client says that drawing really helps them cope with what's going on, again, you give them the scale of 0 to 10. How helpful is it? And they say, I think it's a good solid 6 or a 7. That's definitely something that you might want to encourage them to do and maybe explore similar things that might be helpful in the future. However, if a client is saying that what's helpful, that the way that they cope, that they're coping is to stay in bed and not to talk to anybody and not to move and just stay under the covers, you might say, is this helpful to you? How functional is this? And they might say, well, it keeps me from being scared in that moment, but once I fall asleep and I wake up, sometimes I see that figure at the foot of my bed again, so it doesn't actually help, but I don't know what else to do. Then we rate that pretty low with the client. and we encourage them to try something else and look at all of, and then you can use the various CBT interventions that your textbook talks about, that you've learned in other classes as well, and that you hopefully listened to Dr. Beck talking about in last week's videos. You can kind of begin to approach treatment from a perspective of what's helpful and not helpful for your client. So having talked about the exploration of symptoms, the exploration of the emotions related to the symptoms, the antecedents, the consequences, and the coping, once you put all of that together, hopefully you're starting to get a clearer picture of what's going on for your client and where their symptoms are coming from. Once you have that, we always want to be collaborative with our clients to whatever extent our client is able to collaborate with us, of course. We want to collaborate with our clients to build on that, as I said, and to work forward to create a solid treatment plan. So you might present to your client, once you've talked about all of those things that I just mentioned, you might say to the client, we all struggle, and your textbook gives a really great example of this. We all struggle with different things from time to time. But it seems like from what you've told me, and I'll just use my client as an example, when there's some relational conflict, and you would want to put that in perhaps simpler terms for your clients, but you might say, when there are conflicts going on at home between, say, you and your daughter, for example, and you also have a lot of pressure simultaneously going on at work, and when you haven't really taken the time to take care of yourself or deal with the stress that you're feeling, you tend to have more and more intense visual hallucinations or tactile hallucinations. And your client, especially if they're not experiencing a psychotic break at the moment or not experiencing hallucinations at the moment, might say, you know what, yes, that seems pretty accurate for me. Then you would say, and it seems like you cope by doing X, Y, and Z. So you cope most of the time by just staying at home and trying not to engage with the world. But you're also telling me that leaves you feeling lonely and alone, and that it doesn't actually help reduce the hallucinations. Is that right? Yes, that's right. That's what it seems like to me as well. So maybe if we try to do something different, and this is where you would then enter talking about what the client would find helpful, what they find helpful now, and as the expert in the room, you can suggest things that you might do with your client, whether that's a medication consult if that's necessary, or I don't want to go into it any further because this lecture is already quite long, but the utility, or you can utilize, I should say, the treatment planner and create a treatment plan for your client with specific interventions. So I think I'm going to stop our lecture there for today. I'm hoping that this helped you understand how an assessment and formulation can lead to a treatment plan. And I hope that I've been able to provide some little tips for you beyond what the textbook says in terms of how to actually go about doing so. My goal in these lectures is to kind of bring the textbook alive for you, because you're all adults in a master's level program, and I know that one of the things that I always hated the most when I was in classes was when the professor would just tell me what was already in the textbook. And sure, sometimes that's very helpful, especially when we get busy and we don't have time to read the textbook. But my hope is that we can really use this time to enhance what you're reading. So I'll try to provide you with kind of concrete real-world examples. I'll highlight a section of the chapter that I think is particularly interesting, or has been particularly challenging for students in the past. But if there are things you want to know about other sections of the chapter, about other textbooks, other articles you've read, questions you have from your practica, experiences, or anything really related to the profession. Of course, that's what my office hours are for. That's what email is for. I want you to feel free to engage with me as if we were spending this time face to face in a class. So with that, I will end our lecture for the week and wish you all the very best.